Hi, I'm Josh, and I am so grateful that you have chosen to spend some of your very valuable time with me as I talk about two books by Kurt Vonnegut. The first one is Armageddon in Retrospect, and the second one is We Are What We Pretend to Be. Now, in order to put what I'm going to say about these two books into context, let me just start out by saying that my very favorite books across all genres are the collections of essays and speeches by Kurt Vonnegut that are found in books like Wampeter's Foma and Grand Falloons, which was published in 1974, Palm Sunday, which is from 1981, Fate's Worse Than Death from 1991, and A Man Without a Country, published in 2005. These four incredible books are like my sacred texts, my holy scriptures. They are a blueprint of how to be a kind person in the world. And they are the only books that I'm going to push my kids to read when they're a little bit older, because I think they have just such valuable things to say about life. So if you take away nothing else from this video, just know that I want you to read at least one of these books and then to immediately contact me so that we can have a discussion about it. Now, with that in context, let me talk about why I was thus disappointed by these two books. To fully understand Kurt Vonnegut and his writing career, you need to go right back to his very early adulthood, to a specific event that happened to him that would shape who he was and thus would set the groundwork for everything that was to follow with his own development and the development of his writing career. So we're talking about the Second World War, and it wasn't until near the end of the war that Kurt would join the military and get involved with the war in Europe. So Kurt Vonnegut did just that. He joined the American military and was sent overseas, and very soon after arriving, he found himself involved with the Battle of the Bulge, which was a German offensive that happened as the Germans were getting pushed further and further back by the Allies. They sort of regrouped and then attacked back at the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge, and they managed to capture a large number of Allied soldiers, Kurt Vonnegut being one of the ones who was captured by the Germans. Vonnegut and some of his other fellow captives were then taken into Germany to a city called Dresden, where they were basically locked up inside this meat locker in a closed down meat processing plant at the edge of the city. Now, while they were locked up in this meat locker, the British and the Americans sent a massive fleet of bomber aircraft over the city of Dresden, and in four enormous raids that occurred between the 13th and 15th of February 1945, they absolutely devastated the city of Dresden with high explosives and with tons and tons of incendiaries to just blast and burn the entire city to the ground. Now, this happened, like I said, between the 13th and 15th of February, which was less than 3 months from the ultimate end of the war in Europe, VE Day occurring on the 8th of May 1945. So thus, at that point of the war, it was very clear that Germany had lost, that it was just a matter of sort of mopping up the final resistance and bringing the war in Europe to a close. However, these four raids targeted the city of Dresden, which was more a historical city and had very, very little military presence and really almost no military strategic value. This was a mass bombing of civilians, and in fact, the high explosives and incendiaries that were rained down on the city over those 3 days ended up killing about 25,000 German civilians. Kurt Vonnegut and his fellow POWs survived only because they were locked up in this underground meat locker in the slaughterhouse at the edge of the city, and this event would inspire his famous book Slaughterhouse-5, which is sort of a fictionalized sci-fi extraterrestrial examination of the bombing of Dresden to a certain extent. But after that, the Germans made the Allied captives, Vonnegut amongst them, spend the next couple of weeks digging through the rubble of this vast burned, destroyed city to dig out all the bodies of the primarily women and children and babies, with a few old men here and there, because obviously all the men from kind of teenage years to middle age years had fought in the German army, so there were very, very few men left in the city. And so their job was to dig through the rubble, get out all these women and children out of the rubble so that they could be properly buried. Now, obviously, when the bomber raids came overhead, these civilians hid themselves in cellars and underground, and so some of the deaths that occurred were from the high explosives bringing the buildings down on top of them, but very many more of the deaths were due to the incendiary bombs and the firestorm that resulted in this city. And they weren't necessarily burned alive, although some of them were, but in a lot of cases they were in these small cellars that this vast inferno just sucked all the oxygen out of the tiny spaces they were hiding in, and many of these civilians suffocated to death in the cellars that they were hiding in. So after many days of digging out these bodies from the rubble, they eventually realized it was just too much for proper burials, and before long they were sending in men with flamethrowers to just cremate the piles of bodies on the spot as they pulled them out of the buildings. So you can imagine Kurt Vonnegut at the time being just experiencing this incredible death around him. It really became the defining point of his life and completely altered his worldview and his view of humanity because, like I said, the war was essentially won already. This was purely an act of vengeance on behalf of the Allies to punish the German population for this war that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis had perpetrated against the world. So even though World War II, of all wars in history, was perhaps the one that we could say was truly a just war, a righteous war, and yet the good guys in this conflict were capable of this unimaginable atrocity against civilians and their fellow humans. So this just left Vonnegut wondering, what is humanity? What are we doing to each other? And my personal belief is that all the absurdism you see in the writings of Vonnegut, you see it both in his fiction. Like I said, when he wrote about the firebombing of Dresden in Slaughterhouse 5, he brought in aliens and all these kind of weird extraterrestrial events. And even in his nonfiction writing, these collections of speeches and essays that I love so much, he takes these just weird nonsensical tangents. And so I think a lot of this absurdism in the writing of Vonnegut comes out of the fact that he just, from then on, viewed humanity with this absurdist perspective. Like, how can you even understand humanity and how we treat each other? Vonnegut likes to sprinkle absurdism into his fiction to show that humanity/real life is even more absurd than the absurd. So, regarding Slaughterhouse 5, which was the book that really launched Vonnegut to fame and fortune, Vonnegut had this to say: "The Dresden atrocity, tremendously expensive and meticulously planned, was so meaningless, finally, that only one person on the entire planet got any benefit from it. I am that person. I wrote this book, which earned a lot of money for me and made my reputation, such as it is. One way or another, I got $2 or $3 for every person killed. Some business I'm in." So with all of that as our background, let's dive into Armageddon in Retrospect, the first book that disappointed me here. And the reason it disappointed me is because I thought that this was yet another one of his collections of essays and speeches and nonfiction writings. And I discovered that that's how it started out. It starts out with one of his speeches, but then the remainder of the book is just a bunch of fictional short stories, which, as I'll discuss in a second, his fiction just doesn't really hit me very well, as much as I absolutely adore his nonfiction writings. But the first quote to go along with what I have just been previously saying is from Kurt Vonnegut, and it says this: "Where do I get my ideas from? You might as well have asked that of Beethoven. He was goofing around in Germany like everybody else, and all of a sudden this stuff came gushing out of him. It was music. I was goofing around like everybody else in Indiana, and all of a sudden stuff came gushing out. It was disgust with civilization." And so that's how Vonnegut summarizes his own writing, is disgust with civilization, and we can understand why he says that with the context of his previous war experience in mind. So I'm going to pick out a few points from that essay at the beginning of the book. There's really not much from the fictional side of things that really stood out to me very much. And I think why Vonnegut's fiction doesn't have the same impact on me, it's because Vonnegut in his fiction explores the themes and the ideas that he has about life and that he expresses so well and so clearly in his essays in fictionalized form through allegory and in a more indirect way, which is fine. He has a lot of great things to say, but I would just rather read him say it in plain short form in the essays and speeches as opposed to kind of having to read all the fiction that's around the ideas that he's discussing in his fictional works. So anyways, one of the reasons that I do love Vonnegut's ideas are because he is a humanist. And in fact, he was the president of the American Humanist Society. And you can see that the one thing that Kurt pushed over and over again in terms of what he wanted people to hear with his speeches and essays and so forth is the two-word philosophy that I attempt to live by, which is be kind. And humanism, of course, is all about treating humans humanely, accepting each other, loving each other, being kind to each other. In that way, Kurt Vonnegut was really ahead of his time. As somebody who grew up in the 40s and sort of started to strike out on his own in the world in the post-World War II era, he was someone who was much more accepting of minorities and the folks that society generally treated very badly because of his humanist tendencies and his tendency to view all humans as being valuable. So this first quick quote is about the humanist side of things. Kurt says, "So actually, I am honorary president of the American Humanist Society, having succeeded the late great science fiction writer Isaac Asimov in that utterly functionless capacity. We humanists behave as well as we can, without any expectation of rewards or punishments in an afterlife. We serve as best we can the only abstraction with which we have any real familiarity, which is our community. We don't fear death, and neither should you. You know what Socrates said about death in Greek, of course. Death is just one more night. As a humanist, I love science. I hate superstition, which could never have given us A-bombs." And then he goes on from there. So alongside this humanist aspect, of course, the experiences in Dresden gave Vonnegut a real awful view of war. And as much as there was the necessity for World War II to happen, I think that he viewed war as being an evil thing in general, especially since he had such a close-up view of it. And so he also had this to say. Actually, it's not him that's saying this. It's actually Vonnegut's son, Mark, in the introduction to this book, said this about Vonnegut. "He tried always to be on the side of the angels. He didn't think the war in Iraq was going to happen, right up until it did. It broke his heart, not because he gave a damn about Iraq, but because he loved America and believed that the land and people of Lincoln and Twain would find a way to be right. He believed, like his immigrant forefathers, that America could be a beacon and a paradise. He couldn't help thinking that all that money we were spending blowing up things and killing people so far away, making people the world over hate us and fear us, would have been better spent on public education and libraries. It's hard to imagine that history won't prove him right if it hasn't already." Like I said, Kurt Vonnegut also had a heart for minorities and people who suffered and had less in society. And so here's one thing he had to say. "The most spiritually splendid American phenomenon of my lifetime is how African American citizens have maintained their dignity and self-respect, despite their having been treated by white Americans, both in and out of government, and simply because of their skin color, as though they were contemptible and loathsome, and even diseased." And it wasn't just war that Vonnegut hated because of how people suffered. It was a lot of the structures of society that really caused suffering to those at the bottom of those structures that really broke his heart. And so here's another quote. "I might as well clinch my reputation as a world-class nutcase by saying something good about Karl Marx, commonly believed in this country, and surely in Indian no place, to have been one of the most evil people who ever lived. He did invent communism, which we have long been taught to hate, because we are so in love with capitalism, which is what we call the casinos on Wall Street. Communism is what Karl Marx hoped would be an economic scheme for making industrialized nations take as good care of people, and especially of children and the old and disabled, as tribes and extended families used to do before they were dispersed by the Industrial Revolution." He was also very critical of government, obviously, those at the top who made these decisions and exerted power over the less fortunate. And he's talking specifically about going to war against other people and feeling threatened by other nations who might come in and try to change our way of life and our society. And he asks this question. This actually comes from one of the fictional stories. And one of the characters says, "Folks got to be governed." Another character replies, "To their sorrow," said Elmer. The first person says, "Folks got to be protected," said Ivy, "and armor and castles don't come cheap." Elmer rubbed his eyes. "Ivy, would you tell me what it is we're being protected from that's so much worse than what we've got?" he said. "I'd like to have a look at it, and then make up my own mind about what scares me most." Essentially a little cautionary note to not necessarily believe all the propaganda our government wants us to believe, but to maybe have a look and think for ourselves to see if the story they're trying to tell us is actually the truth or not. One thing I also love about Vonnegut is that he was always comfortable admitting that he really knew nothing and that humanity collectively barely knows anything or understands anything. Vonnegut makes a statement and then says, "The only trouble with that, which is the trouble with practically everything we believe, it isn't true." And in fact, at one point, Vonnegut was confronted by somebody who was concerned about, I guess, some kind of dichotomy between how Vonnegut desires to improve the world and how that fits with a certain notion that was presented in his book Slaughterhouse-Five. And then Vonnegut responded by saying, "You understand, of course, that everything I say is horseshit." So, as much as he is a man to be admired for his great ideas, at the same time, he doesn't want himself or anybody else to be taken too seriously. At the same time, though, despite a kind of absurdist, humorist perspective on things, Kurt Vonnegut did struggle with very deep depression, which obviously would come as no surprise given what he had to experience and go through. Once again, I jump into one of the fictional stories where two characters are speaking with each other. One character says, "Maybe if I'd got a bullet through me or had somebody come after me with a flamethrower, maybe I'd be more of a man." The other character replies by saying, "And hate like everyone else," said Marta. "Yes, and be as sure of myself as everybody else seems to be on account of it." "Not sure, numb," I said. "Numb," he repeated. "Everyone has reasons for being numb." "That's the last defense," said Marta. "Numbness or suicide." And yet, despite, or perhaps because of this deep depression, he did hang on to his humor in all things. Kurt says this during his speech, "I guess all of you know that I am suing the manufacturer of Pall Mall cigarettes because their product didn't kill me, and I'm now 84. Listen, I studied anthropology at the University of Chicago after the Second World War, the last one we ever won. And the physical anthropologists who had studied human skulls going back thousands of years said we were only supposed to live for 35 years or so, because that's how long our teeth lasted without modern dentistry. Weren't those the good old days? 35 years and we were out of here. Talk about intelligent design. Now all the baby boomers who can afford dentistry and health insurance, poor bastards, are going to live to be 100. Maybe we should outlaw dentistry, and maybe doctors should quit curing pneumonia, which used to be called the old people's friend." But this final quote from Armageddon in Retrospect, I think, really nails the main point about how Vonnegut viewed life. And here Vonnegut is talking about his son Mark, who I quoted earlier, and Vonnegut says, "I asked Mark a while back what life was all about, since I didn't have a clue. He said, 'Dad, we are here to help each other get through this thing, whatever it is.'" Now, just before even more briefly diving into the second book here, I want to send out a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, and Asmondas Pervect. You know how much I love you, you know how much I appreciate you, but I just want to keep saying it because it really can't be underplayed how much that level of support does mean to me, so thank you very much. And now back to the second book, which is called We Are What We Pretend to Be. And I'm not exactly sure, I think I just dug this up in a used bookstore somewhere, and I saw Vonnegut and I saw this cool trippy little cover here, and I was like, yeah, that looks like one to be worth picking up. Unfortunately though, it wasn't that great. Now what this is two novellas wrapped up in a single book, and the word novella has always kind of bugged me a bit because I've heard other YouTubers say novella, and I'm like, that can't be how you pronounce it. If a novella is a short novel, shouldn't it be a novella? We're not reading a novel and we're not making novellas, but then I actually went on dictionary.com and I put the sound on and they said novella, and I was like, okay, I guess everyone's saying it right and I'm the weird one here. But anyways, the claim of this book is that this book has the first and last works of Vonnegut together in one book. So the first novella is the first thing he ever tried to publish, ultimately unsuccessfully, I believe. And then the last one is the final novel that he was in the process of writing, but I guess ended up getting turned into a novella. The foreword at the beginning of the book says that the first novella, Basic Training, is a story that was never accepted for publication, and the second novella, If God Were Alive Today, is the beginning of a novel that was never finished. They were written at the beginning and end, respectively, of my father's writing career, 50 years apart. Now, just a note on the title here, We Are What We Pretend to Be, which is a Vonnegut quote, of course. This goes right along with a personal philosophy, where in the past I've written down the following, and this is just my own idea. So what I said was, people waste an inordinate amount of time trying to find themselves when it's as simple as this. You are what you do. You're not what you think you are in your head. You are what you do. No search necessary. You could say that you identify as a pacifist, but if you go around randomly hitting people, what you are is a violent person. So stop trying to find yourself and start trying to define yourself by doing what you want to be. And so Vonnegut's quote, I think, very much agrees with my sentiments there. And this quote comes from his novel Mother Night. And the full quote is, we are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be. And that obviously is where this title has come from. But anyways, this book was even more disappointing than the previous one, because this one is only fiction. It didn't have any speeches or essays from Vonnegut in there. So again, the fiction just doesn't really hit with me for whatever reason. Now, the first novella in this book is called Basic Training, and it is talking about some military experience, and I was shocked at how poorly written it was. Being so used as I am to Vonnegut's unique style of absolutely direct, simplistic prose, I was quite surprised that here was this very different Vonnegut than I've ever read previously, and I could see why it was never published. And at first I was like, oh, that's kind of disappointing to see an author that I admire so much that he could write so badly. But then immediately I was like, no wait, this is actually a great thing, because it shows how bad he was to start with and where he ended up, which is an encouraging thing, because it means that any of us with the right training and the right practice can transform from bad writers to good writers, and if we have the right skill set, maybe even eventually exceptional writers. So here's a quick example from this first novella, and this entire phrase is just Vonnegut's way of saying that moonlight was shining in his eyes. But here's how he writes it. At 2 a.m. Central Standard Time, as reckoned by the parlor mantel clock in the home of Brigadier General William Cooley, retired, a light beam left the burning sun. At 2:08, it glanced from the lip of a moon crater, and a second later died on Earth in the staring eyes of Haley Brandon. Now, if that isn't overwritten, I don't know what is. Now, the story did have a character who I could relate to because of this sentence here. A character speaking and says, "Well, Haley, this boyhood chum of mine was a lot like you from what I've heard about you. He was always reading books, 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 everything he could get his hands on. We used to ask him to come fishing or to play baseball and things like that, and he always had the same answer. No thanks, I just got a new book that looks very interesting." It's like, that was totally me. My brothers would be like, "Hey Josh, come out and play some sports with us outside." I'd be like, "I'm in the middle of my book." So Basic Training, as an individual story, I rated 2.5 out of 10. It was bad. There wasn't much in there I could find to enjoy. The second novella, that was called If God Were Alive Today, is one that I rated 4.5 out of 10. And the title, once again, comes from a Kurt Vonnegut quote. And that title is half of a sentence that is in the story. The full sentence is, "If God were alive today, he'd be an atheist." There were a few quick quotes that I enjoyed here. Here's the first one. And it's a good question for all of us, which is, can't you put down the world and all its troubles for at least 10 minutes? It'll still be there when you pick it up again. Here's an interesting theory from one of the characters. Drug-free Gil Berman was still saying that the government, instead of fighting Keystone Cops battles against popular drugs outlawed at random, should be teaching Americans about all of them and admit that most, but certainly not all, if used in moderation, could be sort of life-enhancing, like Kleenex or toilet paper. The story is about an aspiring comedian who experiences various stages of sobriety and non-sobriety, and at one point he goes to rehab, which he calls this. This is when the character is in rehab and is having a conversation with a psychiatrist there, and it's kind of in the form of an interview of back and forth between the two characters. And the psychiatrist says, "You've been here once before?" And the main character says, "Actually, there's nothing wrong with me this time, thank goodness. I'm back at dear old Caldwell University for my class reunion." "What class is that?" "Upper. What other class can afford to stay in rehab?" But I will end on this final quote that had me chuckling as somebody who has Crohn's disease and who's a loner. So let me just read this. What 18 years of daily doses of Philip's milk of magnesia had done to his lifestyle was something else again. His large intestine had become slack and pouchy and demoralized, causing him to be a loner, if for no other reason than that at any moment he might become what he himself had called, in a high society proctologist's office, a carpet-bombing fart machine. Yes, that is one of a few reasons why I generally don't socialize with other people. So, in terms of ratings, and to quickly summarize here, I rated Armageddon in retrospect a 6.5 out of 10, largely on the strength of the essay, or the speech I should say, that started out the book, and like I said, the rest of the fictional aspect of it was fairly uninteresting to me. And then We Are What We Pretend to Be. I mentioned that I rated the first story in here 2.5 out of 10, and then the second story 4.5 out of 10, which gives this book an average of 3.5 out of 10. Really quite disappointing. In terms of Vonnegut's novels, I've only dabbled a little bit. I've read Slaughterhouse-5 and maybe one other, I can't quite recall. I do want to give him a little more of a chance, and there are a couple of other books from him that I would like to try out. But in the meantime, his nonfiction is absolutely the best. Now, what about you? What books would you say are the best of the best across all genres? What one book would you want everybody to read that you think could even have an impact on how they view the world? Does such a book exist for you? What is it? Please do tell me in the comments below, and thanks so much for watching this. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following. Give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers. And it wasn't really until near the end of the war that he was old enough to get in. And it wasn't, oh my God. We're taken to and later in life, Vonnegut had this quote to say, these collections of speeches and so alongside this humanist aspect, yes, and be as sure of myself as everybody else. Yes, and be as sure of myself as everybody else seems to be on account of it. Ugh. How Vonnegut views life. People waste an immortal... The title, once again, comes from a quote from... It's in the form of a